London is burning. September 1940. The sky glows red as bombs fall across the city. Windows shake, sirens scream. People sleep underground. And somewhere in the darkness, rumors begin to spread. Hitler believes in destiny. The SS wear ancient runes. Himmler searches for lost Aryan secrets. Germany is not just fighting a war, they say. Germany is fighting a holy one. And in Britain, something strange is happening too. A man once called the Great Beast is still alive. An occultist, a magician, a scandal. His name is Aleister Crowley. Whispers claim British intelligence has spoken to him. Whispers say magic is being used against magic. Whispers say the invasion was stopped by more than planes and radar. Is any of it true? Or is this what happens when a nation stands alone, surrounded by darkness? Because in June 1940, after the fall of France, Britain was expected to collapse. It didn't. Why? Was it radar? Was it Churchill? Was it military error in Berlin? Or was something else at play? History books give one answer. Myths give another. And sometimes, the line between propaganda and belief becomes dangerously thin. Tonight, we step into that shadow. Not to chase fantasy, but to understand how war transforms fear into legend. Did Churchill fight magic with magic? Or did Britain win a different kind of battle entirely? This is the story of the war you've never heard about. The war of symbols, the war of belief, the war behind the war. If Britain feared that Nazi Germany drew strength from dark forces, it wasn't paranoia pulled from thin air. The Third Reich carefully built that image. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler founded an organization with a name that sounded academic and harmless. Deutsches Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. Officially, it was meant to study the origins of the German people. Unofficially, it became one of the strangest institutions in the Nazi system. The Ahnenerbe funded expeditions to Scandinavia, Iceland, and even Tibet. In 1938 to 1939, a German team led by Ernst Schaefer traveled to Tibet, measuring skulls, collecting artifacts, searching for proof of an ancient Aryan civilization. The goal was not scientific curiosity. It was ideological validation. The Nazis wanted history to confirm destiny. Himmler, head of the SS since 1929, was particularly drawn to myth. He believed the SS should function not merely as a military force, but as a racial order, almost monastic in structure. Under his direction, the SS adopted symbols inspired by ancient runes. The double lightning bolt insignia was designed by Walter Heck in 1933, based on the Sig rune, meant to represent victory and power. Symbols were never decoration. They were psychological architecture. In 1934, Himmler began transforming Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia into a symbolic center of the SS. The North Tower contained a hall decorated with a 12-spoked sun wheel mosaic, later mythologized as the Black Sun. Himmler envisioned the castle as a ceremonial meeting place for senior SS officers. Was it a cult? That depends on how we define the word. There is no evidence of magical spellcasting shaping military strategy, but there is clear evidence of ritualization, symbolism, and myth-building. And then, there was Karl Maria Willigut. Willigut was an Austrian mystic whom Himmler recruited in 1933. He claimed to possess ancestral memory stretching back thousands of years. He designed ceremonial elements for the SS and influenced its symbolic culture. Later, it was revealed that Willigut had spent time in a psychiatric institution before joining the SS inner circle. Yet for years, he operated close to Himmler. Why? Because the Nazi worldview blurred the line between pseudo-history and belief. Adolf Hitler himself was more complex. Despite later legends portraying him as a master occultist, historical evidence suggests he was not deeply involved in esoteric ritual practice. He was pragmatic, politically calculating, and obsessed with destiny, but not necessarily with ceremonial magic. He did, however, speak constantly of fate. In speeches throughout the 1930s, Hitler referred to providence guiding his path. After surviving assassination attempts, including the July 20th, 1944 bomb plot, he interpreted survival as proof of divine mission. To followers, this reinforced the image of a leader protected by higher forces. And image mattered. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda from 1933 onward, understood the power of spectacle. The Nuremberg rallies were not just political gatherings. They were choreographed rituals of unity, torchlight, banners, sacred architecture. The regime looked mythic on purpose. For foreign observers, especially in Britain and the United States, this aesthetic was unsettling. Reports circulated describing the SS as a pagan order. Newspapers speculated about occult practices in the Nazi elite. Intelligence summaries referenced astrology, mysticism, and strange ideological research. In reality, Nazi leadership had a contradictory relationship with occultism. In 1937 and 1938, the regime cracked down on independent occult societies, fortune tellers, and mystics not aligned with the state. After Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland in May 1941, reportedly influenced by astrological advice, astrologers across Germany were arrested in what became known as the astrologers' action. The state tolerated mysticism only when it served control. Anything unpredictable was dangerous. This contradiction is essential. Nazi ideology borrowed mythic language, Aryan origins, ancient runes, sacred destiny. But it did not operate as a government run by magicians. It weaponized myth for discipline and racial ideology. Still, perception became reality. To many outside observers, especially during the early war years, the Third Reich seemed fueled by something darker than industry. In June 1940, France fell in 6 weeks. The speed shocked Europe. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics were modern and mechanical: tanks, aircraft, radio coordination. But the aura surrounding the regime gave the victories an almost supernatural sheen. Hitler appeared unstoppable. And when a regime appears unstoppable, people search for hidden explanations. Was it superior technology, better strategy, or something else? By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone in Western Europe. The myth of Nazi mysticism had already spread. Books and articles exaggerated connections between the SS and secret societies. Some stories were based on fragments of truth. Others grew in the fertile soil of fear. And fear is powerful during war. It is important to understand Germany's use of symbols was deliberate. The swastika, appropriated from ancient Indo-European cultures, was reframed as an emblem of racial destiny. Runes were redesigned into modern insignia. Architecture evoked imperial permanence. This was not magic. It was psychological engineering. But psychological engineering, when combined with rapid military victories, can look like magic from the outside. By late 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies, the idea of a mystically driven Reich had already taken hold in parts of the British imagination. If the enemy believes in destiny, what does that mean for those fighting him? If Hitler claims providence guides him, does that influence morale? And if symbols can mobilize millions, can they also intimidate millions? These were not abstract questions. They were strategic concerns. Before we can understand the rumors that Britain fought magic with magic, we must understand why those rumors felt plausible. The Nazis did not conquer Europe through spells. They conquered through speed, coordination, brutality, and shock. But they wrapped those victories in myth. And myth, once unleashed, does not respect borders. It crosses the channel. It reaches newspapers. It reaches intelligence briefings. It reaches frightened citizens listening to air raid sirens in the dark. By 1940, Nazi Germany had successfully fused modern warfare with ancient imagery. That fusion would become one of its most enduring legacies. Not because it proved supernatural power, but because it proved how effective belief can be when embedded in politics. And now, with Britain alone and the invasion threat looming, the question began to shift. If Germany was fighting with myth, how should Britain respond? That is where our story turns next. By the summer of 1940, Britain was not only fighting bombers in the sky, it was fighting uncertainty. France had fallen on June 22, 1940. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped at Dunkirk weeks earlier. The Wehrmacht stood across the Channel. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, seemed possible. The country was bracing for physical attack. But there was another concern, less visible, harder to measure. Morale. The British government understood something critical. If public confidence collapsed, resistance would collapse with it. And confidence is fragile in the dark. During the Blitz, millions of civilians slept in underground stations. Night after night, bombs fell. Rumors spread quickly about spies, fifth columnists, secret weapons, strange signs in the sky. In times of fear, people look for patterns, and some look to astrologers. Astrology columns were popular in British newspapers before the war, but once the war began, the tone changed. Predictions about invasion dates or the fate of leaders could influence public mood. British authorities took this seriously. MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service, monitored individuals suspected of spreading destabilizing rumors. That included certain astrologers and self-proclaimed psychics whose public predictions might harm morale. This wasn't superstition. It was counterintelligence. Germany had already demonstrated how propaganda could function as a weapon. Joseph Goebbels's Ministry of Propaganda operated on the principle that repetition creates belief. If enough people hear something often enough, it begins to feel true. And if a prophecy predicts Britain's fall, even vaguely, that can spread doubt faster than leaflets. There was precedent for this concern. In Germany, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, had shown a personal interest in astrology. On May 10, 1941, Hess flew alone to Scotland in what he believed was a diplomatic mission to negotiate peace. Later investigations revealed that Hess had consulted astrologers before his flight. Afterward, Hitler ordered a crackdown on astrologers in Germany. The regime arrested many of them in what became known as the Astrologers' Action. The lesson was clear: belief can drive action. British intelligence watched these developments closely. If senior Nazi officials were influenced by astrology, that meant psychological vulnerabilities existed. But it also meant the public might believe similar forces were at work. War amplifies irrational thinking. In 1940, rumors circulated that Germany might deploy secret weapons. At the time, these fears referred mostly to advanced technology, long-range bombers, new chemical agents. But in popular imagination, the line between advanced science and mystical force blurred easily. Radio broadcasts played a central role in this atmosphere. The BBC became a lifeline for reliable information. But Germany also operated propaganda stations aimed at Britain. Some posed as independent broadcasters, mixing truth with distortion. One of the most famous voices was Lord Haw Haw, the nickname given to William Joyce, who broadcast Nazi propaganda into Britain. His calm tone and insider knowledge unsettled listeners. Psychological warfare was already underway. Britain's response was structured. On July 19, 1940, Winston Churchill authorized expanded operations of the Political Warfare Executive, PWE, created in 1941, but prepared earlier as part of Britain's information strategy. The aim was simple: control the narrative. Fake rumors could destabilize a city. False predictions could erode confidence. The government therefore treated certain kinds of invisible influence as security risks. At the same time, the British public consumed myth eagerly. Newspapers reported on Hitler's obsession with destiny. Articles described Himmler's rituals at Wewelsburg. Stories exaggerated SS ceremonies into dark pagan rites. Some of this reporting was accurate in fragments. Much of it was dramatized. But the effect was cumulative. Nazi Germany appeared not only militarily aggressive, but spiritually charged. In response, British culture leaned into its own symbolism. Churchill's speeches invoked history, the island story, the defiance of Napoleon, the resilience of empire. The monarchy embodied continuity. The Union Jack flew as a symbol of endurance. This was not occultism. It was symbolic resistance. Yet, behind the scenes, intelligence officers considered every variable. MI5 and MI6 did not draft war plans based on horoscopes. But they did understand that if German leaders believed in signs and prophecy, that belief could potentially be exploited. The line between ridicule and strategy can be thin. Was Germany vulnerable to manipulation through its own myth-making? Could false prophecies be planted? Could symbolic gestures influence perception? These were not mystical questions. They were psychological ones. In September 1940, as the Blitz intensified, Britain's survival depended on maintaining collective will. Churchill visited bombed neighborhoods. He stood among rubble and spoke calmly. The performance mattered. Leadership during war is partly theater, and theater operates in the same emotional space as myth. The British government feared many things in 1940. It feared invasion. It feared air superiority shifting in Germany's favor. It feared shortages and exhaustion. But it also feared invisible collapse, the quiet erosion of belief that resistance was possible. Invisible weapons are not always supernatural. They are rumors. They are doubt. They are narratives that spread faster than bombs. As we move deeper into this story, one figure emerges at the edge of this atmosphere, neither fully inside the government nor entirely outside it. A man who had built his life around symbols and belief. A man whose name would later become central to the legend that Britain answered myth with myth. His name was Aleister Crowley, and whether hero, opportunist, or footnote, his shadow lingers over the strangest rumors of Britain's darkest year. By 1940, when Britain was bracing for invasion, Aleister Crowley was 65 years old and living far from the glamorous scandals of his youth. He was ill, financially unstable, and no longer the magnetic figure who had once shocked Edwardian society. But his name still carried weight. And in wartime, weight turns into rumor very quickly. Crowley had spent decades constructing himself as something larger than life. Born in 1875 into a strict evangelical family, he rejected religion early and violently. At Cambridge, he gravitated toward poetry and mysticism. In the 1890s, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, one of Britain's most influential occult societies. From there, his path became a mixture of spiritual experimentation, ego, and performance. In 1904, while in Cairo, he claimed to have received a dictated text from a spiritual entity called Aiwas. That text, the Book of the Law, became the foundation of his spiritual philosophy known as Thelema. Its central idea, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," would later be misinterpreted, sensationalized, and weaponized in the press. Crowley understood media better than most occultists. He embraced scandal. He called himself the Beast 666. He allowed newspapers to brand him as immoral and dangerous. Outrage was part of his method. The more society feared him, the larger his presence became. And this is crucial to understanding his wartime legend. Crowley did not simply practice occultism. He practiced myth-making. The question that follows him into World War II is simple and persistent. Did he work for British intelligence? The origin of that suspicion goes back to the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, Crowley lived in the United States and wrote articles for a pro-German publication called The Fatherland. After the war, he claimed this had been deliberate infiltration, that he was assisting British intelligence by making German propaganda look absurd. Was he telling the truth? The historical record does not provide definitive proof. There are hints of connections, overlapping circles, and possible informal contacts. But there is no clear evidence that Crowley was a formally commissioned agent, running operations on behalf of the British state. Still, by the time the Second World War began in 1939, the idea that Crowley had intelligence ties already existed. When France fell in June 1940 and Britain stood alone, anything unusual suddenly felt plausible. Intelligence services were exploring unconventional tactics. Psychological warfare was expanding. Propaganda was being refined daily. In that atmosphere, Crowley reappears. There are reports that he wrote to British authorities offering his services. He believed the Nazis were deeply influenced by symbolism and myth. He argued that symbols shape the subconscious, that ritual, gesture, and imagery influence collective psychology. In other words, he framed war as symbolic combat. It is important to separate two things here. First, British intelligence absolutely understood the power of symbols. The Ministry of Information, and later, the Political Warfare Executive, invested heavily in messaging. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, coded signals, morale campaigns. These were carefully designed psychological tools. Second, there is no evidence that Churchill's government authorized magical rituals or occult operations as part of military strategy. Documents confirm that Crowley's name appears in intelligence awareness files. He was not invisible to the authorities. But awareness is not employment. Monitoring an eccentric is not the same as commissioning him. And yet, the legend grows. One of the most persistent stories is that Crowley influenced the adoption of the V for Victory sign as a counter-symbol to the Nazi salute. The raised arm of the Nazis, he claimed, could be answered with a two-fingered sign of resistance, a symbolic reversal. It is a compelling idea, but the historical origin of the V campaign traces back to 1941, broadcasts encouraging occupied Europe to use the letter V as a sign of resistance. Churchill adopted the gesture publicly soon after. There is no solid documentation placing Crowley at the center of its creation. Still, the story survives. Why? Because Crowley fits the narrative perfectly. He was dramatic. He was obsessed with symbols. He believed consciousness could be shaped through ritual. And he lived through the war years, close enough to events to plausibly attach himself to them. He also had a habit of expanding his own role in history. After the war, Crowley's reputation shifted again. He became a countercultural icon in later decades. As interest in occult revival grew in the 1950s and 1960s, stories about hidden wartime magic found fertile ground. Crowley's name resurfaced repeatedly, often with little regard for documentation. The crucial point is this: there is evidence of contact and awareness. There is no evidence of government-sanctioned magical warfare. Crowley was a man who believed symbols held power. British intelligence believed morale held power. Those two beliefs occasionally brushed against each other. But brushing against power is not the same as directing it. So was Aleister Crowley a spy? Possibly an occasional informant. Possibly a self-promoting exaggerator. Possibly a man who wanted desperately to be more central to events than he truly was. Was he a magician fighting Hitler with ritual? There is no documentary proof. Was he a charlatan? Not entirely. He was intelligent, well-read, and deeply serious about his philosophy, even if he wrapped it in theater. Perhaps the more accurate description is this: Crowley was a performer who understood myth, and wartime Britain was a stage desperate for meaning. And when a nation survives against overwhelming odds, it often rewrites survival as something larger than logistics and radar. Crowley provided a ready-made explanation, but he was not alone. Because beyond London, in the quiet woods of southern England, another story was forming. one that would turn rumor into ritual and give Britain its most enduring wartime occult legend. If Aleister Crowley provided the atmosphere, the New Forest provided the legend. According to one of the most persistent wartime stories, Britain was not defended only by radar stations and Spitfires in 1940. It was defended by witches. The story first surfaced publicly years after the war. It claimed that in the summer of 1940, when invasion seemed imminent, a secret coven in the New Forest, a wooded area in southern England, gathered in ritual to stop Hitler. The timing matters. June 1940. France falls. July to October 1940. The Battle of Britain rages in the skies. The threat of German invasion feels real. In this climate, the legend says, a group of practitioners of an old pagan tradition performed what they called the Cone of Power ritual, a ceremony meant to focus collective energy toward a single intention. The intention, according to the story, was simple. You cannot cross the sea. The witches supposedly directed this command toward Hitler and the Nazi High Command, projecting a psychic barrier over the English Channel. It sounds cinematic. It also sounds like something written after the fact. The central figure who later told this story was Gerald Gardner. Gardner was born in 1884 and spent much of his early life in colonial service in Southeast Asia. He returned to England in the late 1930s. In 1954, he published Witchcraft Today, a book that would effectively introduce modern Wicca to the wider world. In that book, and in later accounts, Gardner described being initiated into a surviving coven in the New Forest just before the war. He claimed that during the invasion crisis of 1940, members of this group conducted a ritual to repel Hitler's forces. Some versions of the story add dramatic detail. That elderly participants died afterward from exhaustion. That the ritual took place on Lammas Eve, August 1st, 1940. That the power raised by the circle helped shift the course of history. But when we examine the timeline carefully, something interesting appears. The Battle of Britain was decided primarily in the air, through aircraft production, radar coordination, pilot endurance, and strategic errors made by the Luftwaffe. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion in September 1940 after failing to secure air superiority. There is no historical evidence that ritual activity influenced German military planning. There is also no wartime documentation confirming the New Forest ceremony. The first detailed accounts appear after the war, in Gardner's writings, and in later interviews. That doesn't automatically mean the ritual never happened. Private ceremonies rarely leave government records. But it does mean the story emerges in a specific context: post-war Britain. And post-war Britain was searching for meaning. The country had endured 5 years of bombing, rationing, fear, and loss. When survival finally turned into victory in 1945, it felt improbable. Britain had stood alone in 1940 and did not fall. History explains this through logistics, industrial capacity, radar technology, and intelligence breakthroughs, such as code breaking at Bletchley Park. Myth offers something else. Myth says the island was protected. Gardner's account positioned witchcraft not as superstition, but as ancient British spiritual resistance. In doing so, he achieved two things at once. First, he gave modern witchcraft a heroic wartime origin story. Second, he transformed the narrative of Britain's survival into something mystical. And this is where the legend becomes powerful. In 1951, Britain repealed the Witchcraft Act of 1735. 3 years later, Gardner published Witchcraft Today. Suddenly, witchcraft was no longer a criminal accusation. It was a spiritual movement. The timing is remarkable. A nation recovering from total war, stepping into modernity, and quietly rediscovering pre-Christian identity. Gardner framed Wicca as a survival of ancient pagan tradition. Scholars have since debated how much of this lineage was genuinely ancient and how much was reconstructed or synthesized from earlier occult movements, including influences that trace back indirectly to figures like Crowley. The New Forest ritual became foundational mythology. But let's examine the claim carefully. Did witches raise a storm to stop Hitler? Meteorological records from 1940 do not show unexplained weather anomalies tied to ritual dates. German strategic decisions were influenced by military realities, not reports of supernatural resistance. Was there a ritual gathering? Possibly. Small spiritual circles existed. Britain had a long history of folk magic traditions, ceremonial groups, and occult societies. But the leap from private ceremony to decisive intervention in global war is unsupported by evidence. And that's the crucial distinction. The legend persists not because it can be proven, but because it satisfies a psychological need. It reframes 1940 not as a desperate defensive struggle, but as a sacred moment in which the land itself resisted invasion. It transforms fear into cosmic narrative. It turns radar towers into standing stones. It gives modern Wicca a baptism by fire. In reality, Britain survived 1940 because of coordination, sacrifice, intelligence work, industrial output, and German miscalculation. But the myth of the magical Battle of Britain survives for another reason. It restores agency to the powerless. During the Blitz, ordinary civilians had little control. Bombs fell from the sky. Government decisions were distant. Military outcomes were uncertain. A ritual circle in the forest offers something different: participation, intention. The idea that even small groups could influence vast events. That idea is emotionally powerful, especially after trauma. So what do we conclude? There is no documentary proof that magical rituals altered the course of the war. There is clear evidence that the story emerged after 1945, primarily through Gerald Gardner's writings. And there is strong reason to believe the legend helped shape the birth of modern Wicca, giving it an origin story rooted in national survival rather than fringe eccentricity. The magical Battle of Britain was not recorded in war cabinet minutes, but it was recorded in cultural memory. And sometimes, memory is more resilient than documentation. Because once a nation survives the impossible, it rarely wants the explanation to be ordinary. It prefers something larger, something ancient, something almost magical. And that preference is part of the real story. Because if Britain did not fight magic with magic, it certainly understood the power of believing that it could. If Britain did not fight Hitler with spells, it fought him with something far more precise: narrative. By 1940, British leaders understood that modern war was not only mechanical, it was psychological. Armies move on fuel and logistics. Nations move on belief. And belief can be engineered. In July 1940, as the threat of invasion loomed, Winston Churchill authorized the expansion of covert sabotage and propaganda efforts. Out of this atmosphere emerged two key structures: the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and soon after, the Political Warfare Executive, PWE. Their mission was simple and ruthless: confuse, undermine, fracture. If Nazi Germany wrapped itself in myth and destiny, Britain would attack the confidence behind that myth. One of the most effective tools was black propaganda. Unlike ordinary propaganda, which clearly identifies its source, black propaganda pretends to be something else. It mimics enemy voices. It spreads doubt from inside the system. Britain became exceptionally skilled at it. From London, British operatives created fake German radio stations designed to sound authentic. These broadcasts blended real news with subtle distortions. They spread rumors about corruption among Nazi officials. They exaggerated internal tensions. They hinted at betrayal inside the Wehrmacht. The goal was not dramatic revelation. The goal was erosion. Doubt spreads quietly. One of the most famous of these efforts was a station known as Soldatensender Calais. It posed as a German military broadcast aimed at German troops. It played popular music. It read casualty lists. It mixed truth with carefully inserted lies. To a tired soldier listening late at night, the voice felt familiar. But it wasn't German. It was British, This was not magic in the supernatural sense, but it operated in the same psychological space. It altered perception. It shifted emotional tone. It suggested that something was wrong beneath the surface of Nazi certainty. At the same time, Britain flooded occupied Europe with leaflets. Millions were dropped from aircraft. Some warned civilians about upcoming bombings to undermine trust in German authorities. Others encouraged resistance movements. Some spread carefully crafted rumors designed to make German officers question each other. Fear is contagious. Suspicion is destabilizing. And totalitarian systems rely heavily on the illusion of unity. Then there was symbolism. The V for Victory campaign launched in 1941 was simple and brilliant. The letter V became a quiet code across occupied Europe. It appeared on walls, in graffiti, in Morse code tapped across radio waves. 3 dots and a dash. ... dash. It became an audible symbol, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, used as a BBC signal, echoing the same rhythm. This was psychological architecture. The Nazis had built a world of swastikas, banners, and torchlight rallies. Britain responded with a minimalist symbol anyone could draw in seconds. The message was not mystical. It was viral. The war also included subtler manipulations, what might be called false prophecy. British operatives understood that Nazi leadership paid attention to astrology and destiny rhetoric. While there is no proof of large-scale astrological deception campaigns, there were documented efforts to exploit the regime's obsession with fate and symbolism. If an enemy believes history is inevitable, convincing him that inevitability is slipping can destabilize confidence. Confidence wins battles before bullets are fired. Meanwhile, British intelligence worked to destroy the aura of Hitler's invincibility. Reports emphasized German losses. Speeches framed Nazi leaders not as demonic masterminds, but as fragile men propped up by terror. This reframing mattered. The myth of Nazi inevitability was one of its strongest weapons. Strip away inevitability, and fear weakens. Strip away fear, and resistance grows. Psychological warfare also functioned internally. Churchill's speeches were strategic acts. When he declared in June 1940, "We shall fight on the beaches," he was not describing tactical details. He was shaping collective imagination. Language can stabilize a nation. The Blitz could have broken Britain. Instead, it became the foundation of the Blitz spirit, an idea cultivated carefully through press, radio, and imagery. Photographs of stoic civilians, stories of quiet courage, narratives of unity. Reality was more complex. People were frightened. Tensions existed. Exhaustion was real. But the myth of resilience became self-fulfilling. And this brings us to the heart of the chapter. The real magic of the Second World War was not occult ritual. It was the manipulation of perception. It was understanding that humans respond to symbols, repetition, rhythm, fear, and hope. Black propaganda whispered in the dark. Fake radio stations sounded authentic. Symbols spread silently across walls. Speeches transformed panic into defiance. In that sense, both Nazi Germany and Britain fought a symbolic war alongside the physical one. But Britain's approach was pragmatic. There were no recorded spell circles in government basements. There were typewriters, microphones, printing presses, and analysts studying how rumor travels. The Nazis built a mythology of destiny. Britain dismantled it piece by piece, not with incantations, but with psychology. Because when you strip away uniforms and banners, war is fought in two arenas, the battlefield and the mind. And in the mind, suggestion can feel indistinguishable from magic. By now, the legend has grown large enough to ask the central question directly. Did Winston Churchill believe in magic? Because if Britain truly fought an occult war, the decision would have had to pass through one man. Churchill was Prime Minister from May 1940, the moment Britain faced potential collapse. Every major strategic choice, every intelligence initiative, every covert program ultimately flowed through his approval. So who was he? A mystic? A secret believer in hidden forces? Or something far more grounded? Churchill was, above all, a historian. He had written extensively about war long before leading it. He believed deeply in destiny, but in a specific way. He often described his life as guided by fate, especially after surviving political failures and personal setbacks. He spoke of providence in speeches. He framed Britain's struggle as part of a larger historical arc. But invoking destiny in rhetoric is not the same as believing in ritual magic. Churchill's education was conventional. His thinking was strategic. He trusted intelligence briefings, production numbers, naval reports, and air superiority statistics. During the Battle of Britain, decisions were shaped by radar coverage, aircraft replacement rates, and Luftwaffe tactics, not horoscopes. Biographers consistently describe him as pragmatic. Emotional, yes. Dramatic, certainly. But fundamentally rational in matters of statecraft. He had little patience for superstition. And yet, he tolerated unconventional people. This is where the confusion begins. Churchill authorized the creation of the Special Operations Executive in 1940 and encouraged unorthodox warfare. He approved deception plans, sabotage missions, and psychological operations. He supported the use of propaganda that blurred lines between truth and fiction when it served strategic aims. He was willing to experiment, not because he believed in mysticism, but because he believed in results. There is no evidence that Churchill consulted astrologers before military decisions. There is no documented meeting where he sought occult advice. War cabinet records show discussions about shipping tonnage, American support, code breaking, and bombing strategy, not ritual countermeasures. Even when astrologers briefly found peripheral attention within British circles, Churchill did not center policy around them. He was not hostile to symbolism. He mastered it. But he treated it as theater, not metaphysics. He understood performance. When he stood in bombed neighborhoods during the Blitz, cigar in hand, he knew cameras were watching. When he delivered speeches filled with defiance and historic imagery, he knew language could fortify morale. That wasn't magic. It was narrative discipline. Churchill also tolerated strange allies when they served a function. Intelligence work often attracts eccentric personalities. Scientists, cryptographers, double agents, many were unconventional, difficult, socially unusual. Churchill judged them by utility. If someone could produce an effect, crack a code, disrupt enemy confidence, sabotage infrastructure, they were valuable. If they could not, they were sidelined. In that environment, a figure like Aleister Crowley would have been viewed with curiosity at best, not strategic reliance. Churchill's war was industrial and strategic. He believed in air power. He believed in American alliance. He believed in economic endurance. And perhaps most importantly, he believed in morale as a measurable force. Morale was not mystical to him. It was operational. A demoralized nation collapses. A confident nation resists. So when Churchill used powerful rhetoric, he was not casting spells. He was shaping psychology. And that distinction matters, because myth thrives in ambiguity. Churchill occasionally used language that sounded almost prophetic. He spoke of our finest hour. He framed the war as civilization versus barbarism. He invoked Britain's ancient island story. But these were historical metaphors, not occult convictions. If anything, Churchill's tolerance for myth was instrumental. He allowed powerful narratives to circulate because they strengthened unity. He understood that nations need stories during crisis, but he did not confuse story with strategy. So did Churchill believe in magic? There is no credible evidence that he did. Did he believe in the effect of symbols, speeches, and psychological warfare? Absolutely. He believed that perception shapes endurance. He believed that words can stiffen resolve. He believed that if Britain could convince itself it would survive, it would. And in that sense, the truth becomes almost ironic. The man at the center of the occult war legend was not a mystic. He was a realist who understood that belief moves populations faster than facts. He did not fight magic with magic. He fought myth with counter-myth. Not because he thought it supernatural, but because he knew it worked. Churchill did not believe in spells. He believed in effect. And in total war, effect can be more powerful than faith. The war ended in 1945. Berlin fell. Hitler was dead. Europe lay in ruins. And Britain, battered, rationed, exhausted, had survived. History offered explanations: radar networks, air defense coordination, American industrial support, code breaking at Bletchley Park, German strategic mistakes. But history is rarely enough. People do not remember wars only through logistics. They remember them through meaning, and meaning prefers myth. After the war, Britain faced a strange psychological vacuum. The existential threat was gone. The blackouts ended. The sirens stopped. But the question lingered. How did we survive when we stood alone? In 1940, the outcome had not been guaranteed. France had collapsed in weeks. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Hitler's speeches carried the tone of destiny. The SS projected ancient symbolism. The regime looked theatrical, almost apocalyptic. When an enemy presents himself as chosen by fate, defeating him feels like more than strategy. It feels cosmic. And that is where myth enters. Humans are wired to understand extreme conflict as something larger than politics. We frame war as light versus darkness, civilization versus barbarism, order versus chaos. The Second World War, especially in Western memory, became a moral epic. And epics demand archetypes. Hitler, in this framework, becomes more than a dictator. He becomes a symbol of evil itself, almost demonic in representation. His regime's use of ritual aesthetics, banners, torchlight rallies, and ancient runes reinforce that perception. The more theatrical the enemy appears, the easier it is to imagine hidden forces behind him. And if the enemy looks like a cult leader, then victory begins to feel like an exorcism. That is emotionally satisfying. It is also narratively powerful. The legend of Britain's occult defense fits perfectly into that structure. It reframes survival not merely as industrial efficiency, but as spiritual resistance. It suggests the island was protected not only by aircraft and codebreakers, but by something older. It gives ordinary people participation in an extraordinary struggle. Instead of passive victims hiding in underground stations, they become guardians of ancient land. This is not unique to Britain. Throughout history, nations at war interpret survival through sacred lenses. Ancient Rome consulted omens. Medieval kingdoms invoked divine protection. Even in modern secular societies, we instinctively reach for larger meaning during catastrophe. Because randomness is uncomfortable. Chaos feels unbearable. Myth restores order. Post-war Britain also experienced cultural shifts. The 1950s and 1960s saw renewed interest in folk traditions, pagan revival, and alternative spirituality. Figures like Gerald Gardner offered a narrative that linked modern witchcraft to national survival. It was a powerful origin story, not because it was documented in war cabinet archives, but because it answered an emotional need. And then came popular culture, books, documentaries, conspiracy theories, and eventually the internet amplified the story. The idea that World War II contained secret occult battles fits neatly into modern storytelling formats. It merges espionage, mysticism, hidden archives, and secret rituals. A perfect formula for intrigue. Platforms like YouTube thrive on that blend. A title asking, "Did Churchill fight magic with magic?" invites curiosity. It promises hidden layers beneath familiar history. But here is the deeper reason the myth survives. It makes war feel intentional. It suggests that events were not purely mechanical or accidental. That behind strategy and statistics, there was meaning. That good countered evil, not just physically, but spiritually. And belief, once formed, is durable. The myth does not survive because it is proven. It survives because it resonates, because it transforms 1940 from a year of terror into a year of destiny, because it reframes the Battle of Britain as more than an air campaign, as a sacred threshold moment, because it turns radar stations into modern standing stones, because it gives cosmic symmetry to chaos. But when we step back and look carefully, something even more interesting appears. Britain did fight an invisible war, not with spells, but with psychology, with symbols, with narrative control, with morale engineering. And that is where the story circles back to its core. The real occult war wasn't about spells, it was about belief. Nazi Germany weaponized myth to create inevitability. Britain countered with its own narrative of defiance. One side used ancient imagery to project destiny. The other used speeches, symbols, and subtle psychological warfare to fracture that destiny. No rituals altered military orders. No coven redirected aircraft formations. But millions of minds were shaped. And in total war, shaping minds is decisive. So did Churchill fight magic with magic? No. He fought myth with countermyth. He fought inevitability with endurance. And perhaps the most enduring spell cast during the war was not in a forest clearing, but in a sentence delivered to Parliament. We shall never surrender. Not magic, but powerful enough to feel like it. And sometimes, in the darkest years of history, that is more than enough.